We are very proud and happy to have Elizabeth Thompson Colleary come back to give this presentation tonight. I want to say that she is an independent scholar with an expertise in 20th century American art, specializing in the art of Edward Hopper and his wife, Josephine Nivison Hopper, and their two-artist marriage. It's interesting and important to note, as I said, that the very first showing of Josephine's work was here at the museum, and 3 of her original paintings are upstairs in our Hopper room. So when you get a chance to visit the museum next time, make sure to go upstairs and have a look at the Hopper room. Elizabeth also has written a new book, which we have out in the front there for sale. And we also have some lovely, this just arrived today, postcards. If on your way out you want to pick some up. Any questions about the museum's membership or anything, find me in the back. I'm here. And enjoy our presentation by Elizabeth Thompson Colleary. And here she is.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yes. I know the room is deep. I can't say enough about how really wonderful it is to be here and how important. I've lectured at all of the Hopper homesteads, the studio at Washington Square. I've done a lot of work with the Edward Hopper House in Nyack. In fact, the book, the catalog that is for sale, that's an exhibition, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. That was an exhibition at Hopper House last year, or 2 years ago. And when that exhibition was reviewed, the critic in Art News is the one who came up with the title of describing Jo as an artistic force in her own right. That was in response to that exhibition, and that's the catalog that we have here. When Janice and I were making plans, she said, oh, wasn't there a catalog for the show in New York? And so the catalog was done by Hopper House, and now it's here. And I just spoke there last week on the 100th anniversary of Edward and Jo's wedding. They were married July 9th, 1924. And his birthday was July 22nd. So we are steeped in all things Hopper. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the rediscovery of Jo. And again, I can't stress enough how really important this location is. What I'm going to share with you is how I first discovered the work at Reverend Sanborn's home in Florida. And at the time, I had met Diane Shumway. I came up, we have family in Chatham, so I've been coming for years. We started doing the Hopper work, and so I came up poking around Truro and met Diane Shumway in the summer, I guess, of '99. And she took me around, showed me some locations. Really, I knew very little about the Hoppers' relationship with Truro. So one thing blossomed, one thing after another. And what I gradually learned and incorporated into my research is how really important Truro was to the Hoppers and how much we've learned. In fact, when we did the exhibition here 24 years ago, we didn't even know the locations. The watercolors came out of a basement in Florida where Reverend Sanborn had kept them just before Jo died. And so no one else had seen them. So we brought them up, put them on display. And literally people in the community were coming forward and saying, oh, that's Lewis Farm, or identifying different locations, which we didn't know. Anyway, it's great to be here, and Jo is thrilled that this many people have shown up to really learn about her work. It's been a long haul in terms of trying to acquire the recognition that she deserves, that she received in her lifetime. And like many women artists of her generation, they were left out of the books, they were left out of the exhibitions in some cases. And what was wonderful about the discovery of the art, not only did this work emerge, but a lot of her personal papers did as well. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is not only the work, but the way her story has unfolded and how interest in her has really burgeoned. Let me ask one thing. Did any of you see the PBS Hopper documentary? Anybody? Yes? Okay, great. All right, so I'm also going to plug for another event. The Hopper documentary was excellent. The backstory on that is the producers contacted me. I had done a lot of work with Whitney, and the producers contacted me about doing the Hopper documentary, Edward Hopper. And so I said I'd be happy to contribute in any way I can, whatever you want to know that I know about Edward Hopper. But I said, I'm the scholar of record on his wife's work. And they said, his wife was a painter? And I said, yes. And they rewrote the entire script. The whole story was rewritten. Not only that, I've become very good friends with the producer, but when they shoot lots of footage and then they go back and chop it all down, especially for PBS because it has to be limited to 50 minutes. And she was sharing with me, they're literally on the cutting room, things are ending up on the cutting room floor. And every time they tried to take something out that was about Joe, they're like, no, put Joe back. Ed, get rid of Ed. We've had enough of Ed. Let's learn about Joe. Anyway, what I also want to mention, and I proposed to Janice as a future upcoming event, there's another version of the documentary. The documentary that went on to PBS is 50 minutes. There's a longer film, and has anyone seen that? Has it been shown up here? Okay. It's an art house film, quote unquote. It's a 90-minute film, so it's an extra 40 minutes of footage, and it has been shown at various different, in fact, it's going to be shown this week at the Jacob Burns Film Center in Pleasantville. It was shown at the Avalon in Washington, D.C. It was shown at Symphony Space in New York, so it's an art house film, but runs 90 minutes, and there's a whole lot more content. There's definitely a whole lot more about Truro. So again, I'm proposing a screening. We did this in Nyack, we've done it in a few places, and we're doing it next week. But we do a screening, people pay $25, and then I'm doing it with a friend from the Whitney and the director of Hopper House. So we could do something similar here, but it'd be great for you to see the longer film because it just includes so much more footage. But nonetheless, the interest in Joe has just taken off since then. Okay, so let's look at some art. So here's Joe. This is one of the works that came up out of the basement. And I'm going to tell you the story about how all of that emerged. But this is Joe painting Ed painting, and this is one of her portraits of Ed. Both of these are at the Whitney. Whenever they fought, one of the ways that they would make up was Ed would pose for her, which he hated to do. Look at that facial expression. I describe this whole experience of working with this work as being revelatory. Now this is the book. Do we have a copy? Well, you'll see them out there. This is the catalog from the show in Nyack, and this is the cover. So the show in Nyack in 22 was Hopper's Muse. And what's interesting is it's the same artwork. In other words, the work that was shown here 24 years ago was shown right after I found it in the basement in Florida. And it was just, here it is, we knew nothing about it. Then when Reverend Sanborn's son donated the entire collection to Hopper House in Nyack, we did an exhibition just to show it to a larger audience. Obviously, the only people who had seen it here. So now it's 10 years later. So we called that exhibition Grace of Heart. Jo said that once, that her work represented her innocence and grace of heart in French. That was the title of the exhibition. So the purpose of that was just to show the work to a new audience. And then the most recent exhibition, which is what's happening now, and you'll see in a minute, was Edward's Muse. And this is looking at her influence on him, which was enormous. And one of the things that's been exciting in this Hopper saga is seeing how those relationships evolved. This is, well, obviously, who's Edward Hopper? There's Nighthawks. This is the link to the video on PBS video, and this is the link to the larger film. That's also a link to my website. It's just my name, but periodically I add things there, new information. Okay, this gets really exciting. Oh, God, okay. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Oh, gosh, I'm sorry. Okay. I teach, so I'm usually really loud, but the acoustics in the room. Okay, I'll hold this closer to my mouth. Okay, really exciting. Now, this is President Obama in the Oval Office. This is President Obama in the Oval Office in front of two Hopper paintings. One of them was painted by Joe. So what happens, President Obama's people call the Whitney Museum of American Art and say, we want some art for the Oval Office. I know the registrar. She said, what do they want? What do you want? They said, well, just bring what you have. So this is what they selected. He's like, okay, I'll bring some Hoppers. So Obama's people picked these. Now, this is right around the time I started doing research on the difference in their styles. Whitney got the entire Hopper estate. They had no children. The Whitney got the entire Hopper estate, 3,000 works of art. It all came out of the studio in Washington Square. Some of it came out of the house in Nyack, but a lot of work, all of it loose on catalog, much of it unsigned. So the presumption was that all of the oils that came out of the studio at Washington Square were by Ed. Guess what? They weren't. And in fact, do you have Truro Hospitality? Is Truro Hospitality here in the library? It's Snowy's restaurant. Anyway, I think I'm going to show it. Anyway, there's an oil here called Truro Hospitality. It was for a long time in the library. That's one of the first oils I found. And it turns out there are a couple more at the Whitney that are definitely by Joe. And her brush strokes are totally different from Edward's. So right around the time these things went down to Washington, I had already started looking at all the unsigned Hoppers at the Whitney because I suspected that some of them might have been by her and not by him. Now, in the meantime, they're thinking, well, they're all Ed's. They came out of the studio in Washington Square. And in all fairness, I know the Hopper curators at the Whitney well, and it was like not a mistake. No one knew what Joe's work looked like. So they just assumed it was all by Ed. The subjects are the same, which you're going to learn in a minute. So it wasn't until I found half a dozen of her oils that I realized that her style was very different. In fact, I went in looking for this right when it left to go to Washington. And I said, wait a minute, I need to see it. They're like, no, it's at the Oval Office. And I said, well, I'll go see it there. They're like, no, you wait till it comes back. Anyway, long story short, as you'll see in a minute, everything about the way this is painted, there's no possible way it could have been painted by Edward Hopper. Very simple brushstrokes or signatures, but the two most distinctive qualities are Edward Hopper mixed all his paint on his palette and then very deliberately put down every brushstroke. In Ed's paintings, if there's the wind blowing the grass this way, each blade grows this way. Joe was trained as a modernist, which you're going to learn in a minute, which is all about mixing paint and process. Joe just put the paint down. And that's exactly what she did here. This is another 50-slide slideshow explaining why this is by Joe and not by Ed. But there's no way Edward Hopper would paint grass that way. Wrong, wrong. It's not that it's bad, it's just wrong. He would never. This is like, no. So many things in this are, and it's not that it's not as good as his, it's just different from his. And so part of what I'm doing now, again, as the story of Joe continues to unfold 25 years after the work was shown here, one of the things that's emerging is how much work attributed to him was in fact done by her. I just love that one because it's the White House. Okay, this is not anything pertaining to Truro. Okay, how did I start doing it? At least not as far as I know. Maybe that was a loaded question. I've given this talk so many times, and whether it's like 300 people in a museum or 20 people in a room, they always ask, how did you end up doing this? And because it has literally been decades. And it started with this. I'm going to go through it quickly because you want to see more work. So I'm in graduate school. I'm taking a seminar in modern art and psychology. I have to write an 80-page paper. The Hopper retrospective was at the Whitney, and my professor's like, well, what are you writing about? And I was like, well, I don't know. What have you looked at? He said, what have you looked at? I said, I spent time with Hopper. And he said, well, go back and tell me what you see. And I walked around and I was like, what? I mean, where's the lighthouse? Like, where are the boats? Where are the lonely people in the diner? It's like, good God. And then quickly learned that his wife posed for this. I was like, oh dear. This is literally 30 years ago. This is how art history gets exciting. So it's like, oh dear. Not only that, I've now seen every piece of paper you can see about the Hoppers. It was Valentine's Day. He went to the stripper show on Valentine's Day. And Joe wrote that down. You know, Ed said he needed a new subject. He's working on burlesque. She's describing the songs these guys are playing. And I'm like, good God. Also, I have to say, the color on this is off. Her nipples and her lipstick are blazing red. Really brutal red. So I was like, okay. And the fact that his wife posed for it. And then, the more I started poking, I learned that she was an artist as well. So this is your basic, who's Edward Hopper. Obviously, we all know Nighthawks, Lighthouse, Two Lights. So what I started writing about was his images of women. I was like, okay, that's his wife. Let's look at all his women. What's the question? Look at all his women. And again, this has been sort of articles and books and lectures in various stages. What I quickly figured out, and this again is another lecture, but the clothed women, artists paint nude women and clothed women. Hopper's clothed women are really, really alluring. If you've seen this painting, her thigh and her nipples are exposed to the dress. You can see her thigh through here. I'll show you another one in a minute. All the clothes look sprayed on, like they're clothed, but they're very sort of eroticized. The nude women, and he didn't do many, the nude women are all sort of self-absorbed. They don't connect with the viewer. They're in some private space. You could say despondent, whatever, but they're not alluring, not sensual. They're not erotic, whereas some of the clothed women are. Anyway, Office at Night. Now, he's also got an affection for female posteriors. I looked at all of them. He's such, how do you say it politely? He's like a butt guy. I have two theories. But look at this. Seriously. Like, how can you look at that painting? Not to mention her arm is drawn down to accentuate her breast. I literally went back and looked at fashions, like what were secretaries wearing in 1942? Were they spray-on dresses? Now, I can't do it now because this dress is full, but she could not walk in that dress. Look at how tight that is. There isn't even a kick pleat here. Look at how tight that is. It's like a spray-on dress. And again, the arm is dropped. She also can't fit in a chair, which is another story. Proportions are wrong. Joe posed for this as well. In the sketch of Joe, this is closed. So when he puts her in the doorway, he opens it up, gets more erotic. Now, again, this is just from a whole lot of careful looking. There was a Hopper exhibition at the Whitney 2 years ago, Hopper's New York, and a lot of these were on display. And a couple of friends literally said, ask Beth to give you like the butt tour. But once you notice this, it doesn't go away. Now, could she lean over just slightly a little bit more and that towel is gonna go, whoo. You know what it is? I say this to my students all the time. It's choice. An artist chooses. Where is he gonna put the woman? What is she gonna be doing? Why is she there? This is the clincher. Look at the size of the bow and the butt on the table. They're eating dinner, okay? Have you ever been in a restaurant with a waitress who's about to put her butt on your table wearing a bow? Could you accentuate that part of her body more? Again, I went and looked at like waitress uniforms. Were those giant bows fashionable? No. So why is Ed making this giant bow butt on the table? So the more I looked at his portrayal of clothed women, and again, it's another lecture, all of this started to emerge. I also looked at Hopper's images of couples, all estranged in some way or another. They never connect. And Joe wrote a lot about this, that it was always them. And there was strife within the marriage. He's like reading his paper. She's all dolled up. It's Saturday night. You don't just sit at the piano with that dress on. You're going somewhere. Something's going on. You're dolled up for your husband, who's completely ignoring you, which is why you're tapping on the piano. Joe admitted that was her. That's her screaming at it. So again, when you look at all the portrayals of couples. Now again, this is another lecture. I can show you every painting he ever did of women and couples. I call these sexual despondency paintings. There's a series of them. Now they did correspond to when he had hernia surgery, which in those days was eviscerating, as I understand it. But either way, like what? The proportions are also way off. Look at the size of this woman. There's no way she could get into that bed. Joe actually posed for the legs. It's like the body of an adolescent boy. Look at the size of the pillow. I mean, it's just, he does all these odd things with scale that just create this sort of sense of discomfort. This bed is a slab of cement. Look at that bed. Why is there no indentation? It's a slab of cement. Is there anything comfortable, cozy, warm, welcoming? Not a chance. And Joe called it excursion into philosophy, because the butt crack and the book crack. Joe literally wrote about that. And this is Truro, incidentally. This is a local painting. That's the view of the hills outside their house. He is the prototype of what I call the meek man. This was the view, at least Joe wrote about it, that this was the view from one of the windows outside the house, the hills. I call him the meek man. Most of his portrayals of men are shown in, I wouldn't say desperate, but they always look needy. They always look needy. And I think it goes back to his portrayals of his father. His father was not a strong presence in the household. And so we think there's some kind of connection to that. But the men are always sort of at the mercy of the women, or the women are strong and powerful. So there's a lot to look at there. But anyway, when this started, as I said, it was an idea for a paper. And then the more you looked, the more you saw, but also the more of Joe's story emerged. Okay, this is Pink House in Charleston. So now I'm in Florida. I've been doing this research for years. And I'm in Florida visiting Reverend Sanborn, who the night that we spoke 24 years ago, we spoke together. He shared his personal reminiscences about life with the Hoppers, and I shared what I'd learned about the work. So I went to visit him in Florida. We had corresponded. He was a close personal friend of the Hoppers. He was the Baptist minister of the church in Nyack that was up the street from where Hopper grew up. And his sister, who did not marry and stayed on living in the house, was involved with the church. And so as Edward became, I wouldn't say rich and famous, but as he had an independent life in the city, he would send money to Reverend Sanborn to get groceries for his sister and to care for his sister. Now, the Hoppers never had any children, so at the end of their lives, Joe lived 10 months after Ed died. He took care of them, so he took them to and from the hospital. In fact, there's one great story. I did an oral history with him. Ed was in the hospital, I think, for the hernia. Joe was in the hospital for, I know she had skin cancer at one point. They're on 2 different floors. And Reverend Sanborn described going and getting Joe into her wheelchair and then wheeling her down a few floors into Ed's room. And she just screamed at him for like 10 minutes, and then he brought them back. But he said it was very loving. It was very loving. But anyway, he was very closely connected to them. Now, what happened here, and I should also say, Reverend Sanborn was known to all Hopper scholars. We knew he had been a friend, that he had inherited a lot of the contents of the house in Nyack after Hopper died. And in the last 10 months of her life, Joe was going blind. And so that's when she started giving him things. Anyway, I'm in Florida. There had just been a Hopper watercolor exhibition at the National Museum in Washington. So I knew every Hopper watercolor ever. I'd studied them. And this was hanging in the bedroom of the house in Florida. And so I said to Reverend Sanborn, oh, that's a beautiful watercolor by Ed, I assume. I've never seen it. And he said, that's not by Ed, that's by Joe. And I said, well, it can't be. I've been trying to find her work for years and years and years, and I was told it dispersed or whatever. And he said, no, I have it in the basement. And needless to say, I almost missed the flight back to New York. He brings up this box, and that's what came here. So he brought up this box. Oh, I had to show this again. Apple tree from the t-shirt, apple tree from the exhibition. This is one of the things that came up out of the basement of Florida. And literally, she died in 68. This was 2000. So roughly from 1968 until 2000, he had kept these in the basement. And what was astounding to me, again, I knew other Hopper scholars who'd been there. He was well known. And I said, Reverend Sanborn, I do not understand. How could you have had this and no one else discovered it? And he said, you were the first one to ask about Joe. So this, again, is what came up out of the basement. Now, I talk about this as being revelatory. In addition to the exhibition here, there was an article in the Woman's Art Journal. I'm doing a new article right now that's going to actually include this. So a lot of what was shown here was in the Woman's Art Journal, the 2004 article. This is as much as we had learned at the time. And these are some of the other pieces, yeah. This is the Woman's Art Journal article. This is on my website if anyone wants to read it. It's out of print, but you can read it on my website. Okay, so now, what else turns up? The things came up from Florida, which again I'll share with you in a minute. Also at the Whitney, some small oil panels turned up. At this point, I was working on the Hopper archiving project at the Whitney, and the art handlers found a box marked Nivison and called me and said, we think this is work by Joe Hopper. And so, or Joe Nivison at that point. So I went down and found these extraordinary oils, which I'll talk about in a minute. But she studied with Webster. Part of my premise here, this is the Hopper's Muse part of the story. She was a modernist in every sense. Not only did I find her work in the basement in Florida, there were boxes of notebooks and scrapbooks and papers and clippings, all things that she kept. All the exhibitions she was in, who she was showing with. She was showing, before Ed came on the scene, he's basically like home in Nyack until he's 30. She's in Greenwich Village and she's showing in these exhibitions. Charles Birchfield's first exhibition in New York was a 2-person show with Joe Hopper. This is the kind of thing she kept. Now, I was just flabbergasted by this, but as I've learned, again from fellow scholars of lost female artists, they weren't written about, and without these documents, there was no way of knowing that that was the truth of the story. So all of this emerged, but she was, again, a modernist painter. That's the whole thing I was saying about. She just mixed the paint on the canvas. That's how she painted, which Ed didn't. Anyway, she studied with Ambrose Webster, and that Webster book includes a couple of things by Joe. So these are the small oils. They're called pochades. And what they did when she was working with Webster, I have photographs, they would go out all around Provincetown and with these panels, they're about 10 by 14 inches, and they would paint them outside. And this is, again, what turned up. Actually, at the Whitney, the box they found them in was in the Felicia Meyer Marsh bequest. Reginald Marsh's wife, Felicia, was friends with Joe, and so Felicia donated everything of Reginald's to the Whitney as well, and that's where these boxes came in. So again, the art handlers, because it said Nivison, it says Nivison on the back of them. Here it is, Joe Nivison. So I was like, this is Joe's early work. So these are extraordinary. This is Webster's house, we believe. But anyway, this work is extraordinary in terms of describing what she was doing before she started doing watercolors with it. I love this. This is a little sketch. These are caricatures that Ed drew, sort of documenting different aspects of their friendship before they were married and then their relationship. Some of them are sort of satirical, bordering on caustic, Joe doing silly things. But this one is particularly affectionate. If I ever get a publisher for my 2-artist marriage book, the problem being that in order to do the book well, they have to reproduce all of Joe's work in color, because it's never been seen, which is very expensive. But I keep my fingers crossed. Anyway, I want this to be the cover of the book. I just love this. This is the old South Truro Meeting House, which some of you may know of before it burned down. So, and both of them painted the meeting house. So here they're going off, and Ed is, carrying Joe's easel. She's carrying the paint box. She's looking up at him so lovingly. That is correct. He was 6'5", and she was just over 5 feet. Anyway, they're going off to paint together. So, what else comes out of the basement in Florida? This is Revelation with a capital R. So, this comes out of the basement in Florida, and the one on the left comes out of the basement in Florida, and this one on the left comes out of the basement in Florida, and this one comes out of the basement in Florida. I'm going, wait a minute, where have I seen this? This is very well known. Everybody knows this. These are very, very well-known Hopper watercolors. This is the one that piqued my interest. This is really why I almost missed the plane back to New York. I knew this really, really well. I was like, wait a minute, this comes out of the basement in Florida. And I'm like, wait a minute, where have I seen that? And obviously they're sitting next to each other. So here, this is Railroad Gates in Gloucester, obviously right next to each other. So we knew nothing of this. In fact, the other part of the story, and again, I could talk way too long, but I'll move it along. The fallacy of him, I'm alone. I'm alone, I'm here alone. No, she was sitting next to him for 40 years, okay? For 40 years she sat next to him. It's documented in her diaries, and it's clearly documented in the art. So this whole story, again, revelatory. And then once we established that they were painting together, I love this one. Once we established they were painting together, again, I started to look at her influence on him, which was mostly in the palette. I mean, he was always going to be Edward Hopper. He was always going to be drawn toward earthier tones. But most importantly, he gained fame. He hadn't sold a painting for 10 years. And They started doing watercolors together in the summer of 1923. She was a prominent watercolor painter. She was showing her work in all the major modernist exhibitions. Prendergast, Marin, Dove, they were all working on paper, watercolor. And Joe was in all those exhibitions. So she was an accomplished watercolor painter. He had never used watercolor. And a couple of illustrations he filled in, but he was never a watercolor painter. And when they started courting in the summer of 23, she invited him. So they went out together, and you can argue, she taught him how to paint in watercolor. Everyone now agrees with that. So, again, this one I knew, and this is Joe. This is what I love about this comparison. Could you have two more distinctive personalities? In fact, you may notice if you buy the catalog, so I'll just tell you, I sign everything cheerily, and I put my name. Joe, all her life, signed all of her correspondence cheerily, Joe. Even if the bulk of the letter was her complaining about it. He's painting, he hasn't talked to me for 2 days. She'd go on and on and on, various different grievances. But she always signed cheerily. This is her personality, and they're in the same place. It's the circus. It's the summer. We're in Gloucester. And she's got striped tints and yellows. Actually, the color on this is a little washed out. It's brighter, pinks and yellows, and this is a very bright blue and green. And this is the circus. Where's Zed go? Where's Zed go? So I right away, took me a minute, but I first picked up on the stones. Here are the stones, and obviously the gazebo. But where does Ed go? Ed's got the butt of a black car. Like, it's the circus. It's a sunny day. So what does Ed do? And nothing, I like everything, but just in terms of the comparison here, he's got the butt of a Model T and a rusty old train car. We know he liked earth colors. But it's like, could these and also now the sky is cloudy, literally when you see it. This is gray and hers is blue. So I just love this for the comparison in terms of their personalities and how that comes out in the work. But again, back to revelatory. Same thing here. Her palette, she's got peaches and purples and greens and corals. And his, again, is the more dark, somber earth tones. If anyone knows gouache is like a really heavy watercolor. It's almost like tempera paint. And he was an oil painter. So even when he started handling watercolor, it was more thick and dense. I mean, he's still Edward Hopper, and these are still wonderful. But you can see, again, it's the same setting. She's the corals and the peaches and the sort of sunny, cheerful colors. And he's back into this sort of, adobe earth tones. But knowing what these reveal in terms of his working process and hers. So now we're at Cornhill, which you all know, I'm sure. I think we use this as the invitation for the exhibition in 24. It's just absolutely beautiful. I think one of the reasons we chose it is it's got all the fuchsia and the pink. If you have a chance to read the article in the Woman's Art Journal, I wrote at length about, and again, this is what makes her the modernist. These are purples and pinks and fuchsias and greens, just all these really, really rich colors. And his, again, is more earth tone. This is his oil version of this. He also did a watercolor version. I don't think I put it in. No, I did. He did a watercolor version of this. And in the watercolor version, he does start to put in some of this sort of coral. Some of her colors start to appear in his work. Now, this is the Dauphiné House. Some of you may know this. It's still there. This is a test. Which one is by Ed and which one is by Joe? Anyone want to hazard? Well, let me tell you. If it's Ed, it's between 80 and 95 million. If it's by Ed. If it's by Joe, it's worth $3,000, which is what the Whitney, anytime the Whitney loans anything by Joe, the least amount of money that Whitney will insure anything for that leaves the museum is $3,000. Hopefully that will go up. Anyone want to hazard a guess? Which is Ed's and which is Joe's? Which, the one on the left? Okay, who thinks, now I have to remember, who thinks this is by Ed? Who thinks this is by Ed? Okay, see, you're not all short. That's a good sign. Who thinks this is by Joe? Okay, some of you. Okay, good. And who thinks this is by Joe? Okay, good. You got it. You've learned the lesson. This is by Joe. Well, I already told you, her brush strokes are more gestural. The color is brighter. But again, Ed, the grass is blowing this way, and the brush strokes going that way. Jo did not sketch in pencil. She sketched literally in paint. she'd mix a blue wash. She drew with a blue wash. Very rarely. In some cases, after she started working with him, she would use pencil, but this one she didn't. What I think also makes this really distinctively Joe is you can see the water in the distance. See, Ed's is totally shut down. You're not getting out of here. You know, this is it. This is it. He's giving you this wall. You think about all the ways he conveys his psychological meaning, but you're not getting out of there. And it's dark and somber, and who knows, it's like Twilight Zone. Whereas in Joe, you know, you've got the water off in the distance and the bright sun and all of this. But again, this could not be by Ed because it's too painterly. It's too much about paint. Ed was always concerned about representation. Oh, so this is a very, very famous watercolor that Whitney owns, that everybody knows it. The one on the right came out of the basement in Florida. It's like, wait, that's the painting that Joe's painting, and the painting of Joe painting. Okay? So this is very famous. This is Edward's painting of Joe painting that painting. And here it is. So, as I said, revelatory. They use the car as a studio. They push the seat up because Joe's only 5 feet. And Ed painted the back. And that's him painting her painting, that painting. So this gets very exciting. It turns out there are actually a couple of them. This one is at Hopper House in Nyack. And there are a couple of them with me. Okay, now this gets really interesting also. One of the things that Joe listed in her notebooks, she had listed all the work that she did, where she showed it, and she showed a lot of still lifes of flowers, fruit baskets, $25. One was bought by Juliana Force, who at that time was putting together the collection for the Whitney Museum of American Art, working with Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, so Joe's work was in that original founding collection, and it was a still life. This came out of the basement in Florida, and I knew Joe wrote about it, the very distinctive handle. Their friend B. Blanchard sent them fruit every year, and they came in this distinctive basket, and Joe called them bee baskets. So she painted it. This is one of her bee baskets. This is owned by the Met. The Met bought this in 1930 from Edward Hopper. It left the studio and has hung at the Metropolitan ever since then. I know it really, really well. And it's a very big painting. This, again, turned up in Florida, and I got back to New York, and I was like, wait a minute, where have I seen that basket? Go running over to the Met, and here it is. Now, what's interesting about it is Edward Hopper literally said he didn't like still life, never did a painting of a vase with flowers. I think Room in Brooklyn is a little vase, 2 flowers. He didn't do still life, wasn't interested in still life, didn't like still life. Not only that, but he did pencil sketches of pretty much everything in his paintings. Like Nighthawks, he did pencil sketches of the salt and pepper shakers sitting on the counter. So it's rare, like never, that a major element appears in a Hopper painting without any prior sketches. So it's really not a leap to think he just took that from Joe. And there are other examples. There are other examples of her work, elements of her work appearing, what is it, second story sunlight, the figure sitting on the sort of the edge of the balcony or the second floor. It comes from a sketch that Joe did. So we have a few other examples of work by Joe that Ed just took and put in his work. It's interesting too because this is sort of the focal point, but it's not like he never did a study of a pineapple. I mean, there's no evidence that he ever sketched any of these. She did do several pineapples. This is just the one that's the closest because it's the basket. So again, looking at the relationship between the two of them illuminates his working process and also obviously tells us about hers. Okay, so these were 2 recent exhibitions. This was last year, Edward Hopper's Gloucester. This exhibition was at the Cape Ann Museum last year. And this was the Edward Hopper's New York at the Whitney. And both of them included work by Joe, and that was sort of unheard of. This particular watercolor, which was here, I think this was shown here because Sanborn owns this. So it's now at Nyack, and they borrowed that. And it was in a section of the exhibition about their life together at Washington Square at the studio, and that's where that was painted. And then obviously that's Gloucester. So several pieces by Joe were included in the Cape Ann exhibit. I do have to say though, let me see. Oh yeah, so this is the end of it. Part of the problem, this is what I'm working on now, the Gloucester exhibition, they did both paint together there several times, but unfortunately, the few art historians who have given credit to Jo and her role in the Hopper marriage have failed to acknowledge her as an artist in her own right. So the curator who did the exhibition in Gloucester literally wrote about, well, I'm putting all of Jo's work on display and I'm recognizing Jo. In fact, I read her catalog, she sent it to me, she said, you're the scholar of record on Jo, can you read this? Which I did, I basically fact-checked it. What I didn't know was that she was going to present Jo in several chapters in the book as the ultimate subservient helpmate to Ed. So, in fact, the last thing she said at the end of the book was Jo's most important contribution to the history of American art was how much she did for Ed. I was like, no. And unfortunately, that is too often the way that this story is told. Yes, she helped promote his work. He was painfully shy. He was depressed. He couldn't work. She'd start to work. She'd inspire him. All of that is true. But she, as an artist in her own right, is long overdue, worthy of recognition for what she did and what she accomplished. And again, that's what I'm writing now. I'm doing the book. And an article coming out in the Women's Art Journal in November is all about that. That artistic force in her own right means pulling her away. I said to the editor, I'd like to not use Ed's name. Can I write this article without using Ed's name? Well, just mention that she got married in 1924 to an artist, but let's leave it there. She didn't get married till she was 40, and before she got married, he's, again, in Nyack, in his boyhood bedroom. She's in Greenwich Village, performing with the Washington Square Players, showing in all the major modernist exhibitions. She's writing reviews in the Villager. The first exhibition review of John Sloane's new watercolors was written by Jo Nivison. So all of this has come out of the paper. She was an artist of stature. She was recognized by the intelligentsia, all the people who she was hobnobbing with. And I will finish shortly, but one of the things that emerged from the pile of papers that Reverend Sanborn had kept was a series of letters. It's well known she was a virgin when she married, but that didn't mean she didn't have prior romances. And what emerged from her papers, she had a torrid relationship with a bisexual Nicaraguan poet who was two-timing her with Edna St. Vincent Millay. So this all turns up in the papers. So what do? I go running to Washington to go through all of the Millay papers at the Library of Congress. They're very helpful there. They keep bringing out carts. I was there for 3 days. And I was like, I gotta find, where's Jo? Edna St. Vincent Millay. This is also the year Millay won the Pulitzer, first woman to win the Pulitzer. And finally, the last box of papers, the last folder, the Nicaraguan poet had to go back to Nicaragua. There was a coup, whatever. He gives Millay his power of attorney, and he writes at length, please take care of Jo. Reach out to Jo. Jo has always been there for me. So he's, at this point, waxing poetic, but it definitely establishes the connection. There's also another boyfriend who was the director of the Washington Square Players. Jo performed with them, sort of bit parts. But anyway, her relationship with him was also tied. I'm writing about all this. But the thing is, this is the life she had in New York before she got married at the age of 40. So to now just say, well, she helped Ed out, she did his correspondence. What's really important is what she did for Ed. And it is important, but that's not the story. The story is that she is an artistic force in her own right. There we go. Yes, that's it. So I'm in the process of rediscovering her, and we're already talking about the possibility of doing a 25th anniversary exhibition next year, because it'll be the 25th year since the work was first shown here. So we can have more work and more about what we've learned about Jo. So that's it. Thank you.
tantalizing.
Never boring.
Presentation,
Never boring.